The cargo bay of the starship Valiant Dawn hummed with activity as the Galactic Defense Coalition's newest recruits prepared for their first mission. Among the towering Krillian warriors with their chitinous armor and the sleek Zephyrian pilots with their enhanced reflexes, Lieutenant Sarah Chen looked almost comically small. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than most alien weapons, she drew skeptical glances from her teammates. Commander Vexthul, a massive Krillian whose mandibles clicked disapprovingly, addressed the assembled strike team. "We are tasked with infiltrating the Void Wraith Fortress on Mandar, Kepler 442b. Intelligence suggests they are developing a weapon capable of destroying entire star systems." His compound eyes fixed on Sarah. "This mission requires only the strongest and most capable warriors." The implication hung heavy in the recycled air. Sarah had been assigned to the team not for her combat prowess, but because Earth's membership in the coalition required human representation in major operations. Everyone knew it. The whispers followed her through the corridors. In multiple languages and clicking sounds she was still learning to understand. "The human will slow us down," muttered Sergeant Zix, a Zephyrian whose translucent skin rippled with bioluminescent patterns of annoyance. Their species barely survived their own planetary conflicts. How can they hope to stand against the Void Wraiths? Sarah kept her expression neutral, though her hands clenched slightly at her sides. She had graduated top of her class from the Coalition Academy, mastered 7 alien languages, and scored perfect marks in tactical analysis. But none of that seemed to matter when she stood next to beings who could crush starship hulls with their bare hands or move faster than human eyes could track. The mission briefing continued with detailed schematics of the Wraith Fortress. The structure was a nightmare of organic architecture, grown rather than built, with walls that pulsed like living tissue and corridors that could shift without warning. The Void Wraiths themselves were parasitic entities that consumed the life force of other beings, leaving behind empty husks that served as their soldiers. "The fortress shields are impenetrable to conventional assault," Commander Vexthul explained. "We must infiltrate through the thermal exhaust ports and disable the shield generators from within. Speed and stealth will be essential." As the team equipped themselves with weapons and gear, Sarah noticed how the others naturally grouped together, leaving her to prepare alone. The Krillians shared equipment designed for their massive frames, while the Zephyrians synchronized their suits with practiced efficiency. Sarah checked her own gear methodically. A standard-issue Coalition rifle that looked oversized in her hands and armor plates that had been modified to fit her smaller frame. "Perhaps the human should remain on the ship," suggested Captain Mordun. Another Krillian whose scarred carapace spoke of countless battles. "As communications officer, someone should coordinate with command while the real warriors handle the mission." The suggestion was delivered with what passed for kindness among Krillians, but Sarah recognized the dismissal for what it was. She was being offered a graceful way to step aside, to acknowledge her limitations and let the superior species handle the dangerous work. "I appreciate the concern," Sarah replied carefully, "but I'm assigned to this mission for a reason. I'll pull my weight." Commander Vexthul's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement or annoyance. "Very well. But understand that we cannot slow our pace to accommodate human limitations. If you fall behind, you will be left behind." The ship shuddered as it entered the atmosphere of Kepler 442b, a dead world stripped of life by centuries of Void Wraith occupation. Through the viewport, Sarah could see the twisted spires of the fortress rising from a landscape of crystallized bone and withered vegetation. The very air seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy. As they approached the landing zone, Sarah ran through her equipment one final time. Her rifle was loaded with quantum disruption rounds designed to destabilize Wraith energy matrices. Her armor incorporated human innovations that the other species had dismissed as primitive. Redundant systems, manual overrides, and analog backups that couldn't be compromised by electronic interference. The other team members were checking their own gear with the casual confidence of seasoned warriors. Their weapons were works of art, incorporating technology that humanity was only beginning to understand. Their armor was perfectly fitted, enhancing their already formidable natural abilities. "Remember," Commander Vexthul addressed them as the ship touched down, "the Void Wraiths are unlike any enemy you have faced. They do not simply kill, they consume the very essence of life itself. Stay alert, stay together, and trust in your training. Sarah felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her as the cargo bay doors opened. The atmosphere of Kepler 442b was barely breathable, requiring breathing apparatus that fogged slightly in the alien air. The ground beneath their feet felt wrong somehow, as if it might give way to reveal something terrible lurking beneath. The fortress loomed ahead of them, its organic walls pulsing with a sickly light. Dark shapes moved in the shadows between the spires, and Sarah's enhanced visor detected energy signatures that made her skin crawl. This was no ordinary military installation. It was a living thing, feeding on the death that surrounded it. As they began their approach, Sarah noticed how the other team members unconsciously positioned themselves to protect their flanks and rear, but left her to cover the supposedly safe middle ground. They were operating under the assumption that she would be the first to fall, the weak link that would compromise their mission. What they didn't know was that Sarah had spent the last 6 months studying not just void wraith tactics and technology, but the psychology and combat doctrines of her own teammates. She understood their strengths and their blind spots better than they understood themselves, and she had a plan that none of them would see coming. The thermal exhaust ports were exactly where intelligence had predicted, hidden beneath a ridge of bone-like protrusions that clicked and shifted in the alien wind. Commander Vexthul raised his massive hand, signaling the team to halt as they crouched in the shadow of a crystallized tree that had once been living wood. "Wraith Patrol. 2 clicks northwest," whispered Captain Morden, his enhanced vision picking up movement that the others couldn't detect. Standard formation. 3 drones led by a harvester. Sarah activated her visor's threat assessment system and immediately understood why her teammates looked so tense. Harvester wraiths were among the most dangerous enemy units, capable of draining life force from multiple targets simultaneously, while coordinating drone attacks with telepathic precision. "We wait for them to pass," Commander Vexthul decided. "No unnecessary risks." But as they watched, Sarah realized something the others had missed. The patrol wasn't random. It was following a specific pattern, one that would bring it directly over their infiltration route in exactly 12 minutes. Her tactical analysis subroutines, enhanced by human pattern recognition abilities that other species often overlooked, had identified a flaw in their approach. "Commander," she said quietly, "the patrol timing suggests they know we're here." Sergeant Zix's bioluminescent patterns flashed with skepticism. "Impossible. Our stealth systems are military grade. The human is seeing threats that don't exist." Sarah pulled up her tactical display, overlaying patrol routes she had been tracking since they landed. "Look at the movement patterns. They're not patrolling randomly. They're herding us toward the exhaust ports. It's a trap." Commander Vexthul studied her data with growing concern. The evidence was compelling, but accepting it meant acknowledging that their intelligence was compromised and their mission plan was flawed. More importantly, it meant admitting that the human had spotted something that trained Krillian warriors had missed. "Even if you're correct," Captain Morden interjected, "we have no alternative entry point. The mission parameters are clear." Sarah had been expecting this response. She had spent weeks studying the fortress schematics, looking for details that others might have dismissed as irrelevant. "There is another way. The organic walls aren't just decorative. They're part of a living system that requires nutrition. There should be feeding conduits that connect to external sources." She highlighted a section of the fortress that appeared to be solid wall, but showed subtle temperature variations in infrared scanning. "If we approach from the eastern face, we can access the nutrient intake systems. They'll be too small for most species, but a human could navigate them." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah had just proposed splitting the team and using her small size, previously seen as a liability, as a tactical advantage. It was either brilliant or suicidal, and none of the aliens were sure which. "You're suggesting we send our weakest member alone into unknown territory, while the rest of us create a distraction at the main entrance," Commander Vexthul said slowly. "The risk to mission success is unacceptable. The risk of walking into an obvious trap is even higher," Sarah replied. "I can reach the shield generators from inside while you engage the wraith forces at the exhaust ports. When their attention is focused on you, I'll disable their defenses." Sergeant Zix's patterns had shifted to colors Sarah was learning to associate with profound doubt. "And if you fail? If you are captured or killed, the entire mission depends on a single human who has never faced combat." Sarah met each of their gazes in turn. She could see the calculations running behind their eyes. The risk of trusting her versus the risk of proceeding with a compromised plan. They were warriors who had survived countless battles by relying on overwhelming force and tactical superiority. The idea of depending on stealth and cunning from their weakest team member challenged everything they believed about combat. "I won't fail," she said simply. "But if I do, you'll still have accomplished the primary objective of engaging Wraith forces and gathering intelligence on their capabilities. Command needs that data regardless of whether we destroy the weapon." Commander Vexthol's mandibles clicked rhythmically as he processed the options. Around them, the alien landscape seemed to pulse with malevolent awareness, as if the fortress itself was listening to their conversation. The Harvester Patrol was still moving in its predictable pattern, confirming Sarah's analysis that they were being manipulated. "The human makes tactical sense," Captain Mordoon admitted reluctantly, "but the nutrient conduits will be filled with digestive enzymes and organic waste. Even if she survives the journey, she'll emerge weakened and possibly poisoned." Sarah had already considered this problem and prepared countermeasures that her teammates wouldn't expect. Human biology, for all its apparent frailty, had evolved some remarkable resistance mechanisms. Her modified armor included chemical filters and neutralization systems that could handle brief exposure to hostile organic environments. "I've prepared for the environmental hazards," she said, showing them her equipment modifications. "These adaptations are based on human waste management and chemical processing techniques that most species don't need to develop." The aliens exchanged looks that Sarah was beginning to recognize as a mixture of disgust and grudging respect. Her species' ability to survive in contaminated environments was apparently both revolting and impressive to beings who had evolved on cleaner worlds. "Very well," Commander Vexthul decided. "We will attempt your plan. But understand that once we begin the assault on the exhaust ports, we cannot provide assistance if you encounter difficulties. You will be entirely on your own." Sarah nodded, checking her equipment one final time. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden. She had trained for this moment her entire military career, but she had never imagined it would come in the form of crawling through alien digestive systems while her teammates fought for their lives. As they prepared to split up, Sergeant Zix approached her with something that might have been concern flickering in his bioluminescent patterns. "Human, Sarah. Your plan is sound, but the wraiths inside the fortress will be different from those outside. They will be older, stronger, more cunning. Do not underestimate them because of their alien nature." It was the first time any of her teammates had used her name, and Sarah felt an unexpected surge of emotion. "I won't, and Zix, when you hit those exhaust ports, hit them hard and fast. I need their attention focused entirely on you." The Zephyrian's pattern shifted to what Sarah hoped was determination. "We will give you the distraction you need. Do not waste it." As Sarah began making her way toward the eastern face of the fortress, she could hear her teammates moving into position for their assault. Soon she would be completely alone, crawling through hostile alien architecture with only her wits and preparation to keep her alive. The irony wasn't lost on her. The team's weak link was about to become their only hope for success. The nutrient intake valve was exactly where Sarah had predicted, hidden beneath a fold of organic matter that felt disturbingly warm to the touch. Her modified tools made quick work of the biomechanical locks, systems that had clearly evolved to keep large predators out, but hadn't anticipated something as small and determined as a human engineer. As she squeezed through the opening, Sarah's armor automatically sealed against the hostile environment. The conduit beyond was a nightmare of pulsing walls and flowing liquids that her scanner identified as partially digested organic compounds. The smell would have been overwhelming without her helmet's filtration system, but even with protection, she could detect the sweet, sick odor of decay and alien biochemistry. The passage was barely wide enough for her shoulders, confirming her theory that no other member of her team could have attempted this infiltration. As she crawled through the organic tunnel, guided by her suit's navigation system and the building schematics she had memorized, Sarah reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she had been a maintenance engineer on Luna Station, fixing atmospheric recyclers and complaining about boring assignments. Now she was crawling through the digestive system of an alien fortress, carrying explosives that could disable shields protecting a planet-killing weapon. The sound of weapons fire echoed through the fortress structure, transmitted through the organic walls like a heartbeat. Her teammates had begun their assault on the exhaust ports, and from the intensity of the battle sounds, they were encountering exactly the kind of resistance Sarah had predicted. The wraiths had indeed been waiting for them, but hopefully her distraction would serve its purpose. As she navigated deeper into the fortress, Sarah encountered her first major obstacle. The nutrient conduit branched into 3 smaller passages, none of which appeared on the schematics provided by Coalition intelligence. She was now operating in uncharted territory, relying entirely on her own judgment and the tactical principles she had learned during her accelerated military training. Her suit's sensors detected different energy signatures from each passage. The leftmost showed high levels of electromagnetic activity, suggesting proximity to the fortress's power systems. The center passage registered biological activity that her computer couldn't identify, while the rightmost tunnel showed traces of quantum distortion consistent with shield generator technology. Sarah chose the right passage, following the quantum signatures toward what she hoped would be the shield control systems. The tunnel gradually widened as she progressed until she could finally stand upright in a chamber that resembled the inside of a massive organ. Bioluminescent growths provided eerie illumination, revealing walls that pulsed with a rhythm distinctly different from the fortress's main heartbeat. Through the translucent wall material, she could see movement in adjacent chambers. Wraith drones floated through corridor spaces, their ghostly forms radiating the cold energy that was their species' trademark. But these weren't the mindless automatons that typically served as foot soldiers. These drones moved with purpose and intelligence, coordinating their actions in ways that suggested individual consciousness rather than hive mind direction. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, using her suit's passive sensors to map the area beyond her hiding place. The chamber she was observing appeared to be some kind of control nexus, with wraith entities interfacing directly with organic control systems through tendrils of energy that flowed between their forms and the living machinery. More importantly, she could see the distinctive crystalline structures that housed shield generator components. The Coalition had been wrong about wraith technology being purely organic. They had learned to integrate crystalline quantum computers with their biological systems, creating hybrid technology that was more advanced than anything humanity or their allies had developed. As she watched, one of the wraith controllers suddenly stopped its work and turned toward her hiding place. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought she had been detected, but the entity's attention was focused on something beyond her position. Through her suit's audio pickups, she heard the distinctive sound of Krillian battle roars echoing through the fortress structure. Her teammates' assault was intensifying, and the wraiths were responding by redirecting resources to counter the threat. This was exactly what Sarah had hoped for, but it also meant she was running out of time. Soon the wraiths would realize that the attack on the exhaust ports was a diversion, and they would begin searching for the real threat. Sarah activated her suit's technical interface systems and began analyzing the shield generator configuration. The quantum crystals were protected by both energy barriers and biological defenses, but there were access points designed for maintenance and adjustment. If she could reach the primary control nexus, she might be able to overload the entire system using techniques that human engineers had developed for handling unstable quantum matrices. The approach would require her to cross 30 meters of open space, while wraith controllers worked at their stations. Her suit's stealth systems were good, but they weren't designed to fool entities that existed partially in energy dimensions beyond normal matter. She would need to rely on timing, speed, and the hope that the wraiths would remain focused on the battle raging elsewhere in the fortress. Sarah prepared her equipment for the final phase of the infiltration. Her explosives were small but precisely designed, intended to create cascading failures in quantum containment systems, rather than simple destruction. The techniques were based on human experience with reactor maintenance, knowledge that other species had dismissed as primitive, but which turned out to be exactly what was needed for this mission. As she prepared to move, Sarah activated her suit's communication system and sent a coded burst transmission to her teammates. The message was simple: in position. Continue assault for 10 more minutes, then withdraw to safe distance. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. Either her teammates would trust her timing or they wouldn't. Either way, she was committed to the mission now. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her equipment one final time, and prepared to cross the chamber toward the shield generators. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. The team's supposed weak link was about to attempt the most critical phase of the mission, while the mighty warriors she had been assigned to support created a diversion. If she succeeded, it would validate every argument she had made about the value of human ingenuity and adaptability. If she failed, it would confirm every prejudice her teammates held about human limitations. But as Sarah began her careful advance toward the Wraith control systems, she felt a calm confidence settling over her. This was what she had trained for, what her species did best. Humans didn't win through superior strength or speed. They won by being smart, adaptable, and absolutely refusing to give up when the stakes were highest. The shield generators hummed with lethal energy just meters away, waiting for a small human engineer to prove that sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly what the situation demands. Sarah moved across the chamber with careful, deliberate steps, timing her movements to coincide with the rhythmic pulses of the fortress's biological systems. Her suit's stealth field bent light around her form, but she knew that Wraith entities could detect disturbances in quantum fields that normal sensors would miss. Every step was a calculated risk. Every breath a potential betrayal of her position. The first Wraith controller was positioned directly in front of the primary shield matrix, its ethereal form partially merged with the organic control interface. Tendrils of energy flowed between the entity and the crystalline components, creating a feedback loop of consciousness and technology that defied conventional understanding. Sarah had studied Wraith biology extensively, but seeing their hybrid existence in person was both fascinating and terrifying. As she crept closer, Sarah could observe the shield system's operation in detail. The quantum crystals weren't just power sources. They were processing nodes in a distributed computing network that existed partially in normal space and partially in the energy dimensions where Wraiths naturally resided. Disrupting the system wouldn't be as simple as destroying the crystals. She would need to create a resonance cascade that would propagate through the entire network. The sound of battle from the exhaust port area was growing more intense, punctuated by the distinctive energy discharges of Krillian plasma weapons and the high-pitched whine of Zephyrian particle beams. Her teammates were holding up their end of the plan, but Sarah could tell from the audio patterns that they were taking casualties. The Wraiths had been well prepared for the assault, and even the formidable warriors of the coalition were struggling against the enemy's superior numbers and defensive positions. Sarah reached the base of the shield generator assembly and began unpacking her specialized equipment. The quantum destabilization charges she carried were based on human nuclear engineering principles, adapted for use against crystalline matrix systems. The theory was sound, but she had never tested the devices against actual Wraith technology under combat conditions. As she worked to position the charges, one of the Wraith controllers suddenly separated from its interface and turned in her direction. For a heart-stopping moment, Sarah froze, certain that her stealth field had failed and she was about to be discovered. But the entity's attention was focused on something beyond her position. Emergency signals from the fortress's perimeter defenses. Through the translucent walls, Sarah could see more Wraith forces mobilizing to counter her teammates' assault. The defenders were pulling resources from internal security to reinforce the threatened areas, exactly as she had hoped. But she also noticed something that made her blood run cold. The Wraiths weren't just responding defensively. They were preparing a counterattack that would trap her teammates in a killing zone. Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could complete her mission to disable the shields, potentially saving countless lives by preventing the deployment of the planet-killing weapon. Or she could abandon her position to warn her teammates about the trap, sacrificing the mission to save the lives of beings who had never trusted her capabilities. The decision came to her with startling clarity. Her teammates were warriors who had accepted the risks of their profession, but they had trusted her plan and put their lives on the line to give her this opportunity. She owed them the success that would justify their sacrifice. Sarah activated the first quantum charge and began the delicate process of interfacing it with the Wraith control system. The device's human-designed circuits had to interpret alien quantum states and translate them into familiar patterns that her equipment could manipulate. It was like trying to perform surgery using tools designed for a completely different type of anatomy. The charge connected successfully, but immediately triggered defensive responses from the Wraith technology. Alarm signals began pulsing through the fortress's nervous system, and Sarah realized that her presence would be detected within minutes. She had to complete the installation and trigger the cascade before the fortress's immune responses could isolate her charges. Working with desperate efficiency, Sarah installed the remaining charges at critical nodes throughout the shield matrix. Each device had to be precisely calibrated to create constructive interference patterns that would amplify the disruption effect across the entire network. One miscalculation would cause the charges to cancel each other out, leaving the shields intact and her mission a failure. As she worked, Sarah became aware that the battle sounds from outside were changing. The steady rhythm of weapons fire was becoming more chaotic, punctuated by what sounded like retreat signals. Her teammates were being forced back, and soon the Wraiths would have time to search for intruders within the fortress itself. The final charge clicked into position, just as the first Wraith controller noticed the quantum disturbances in its interface. The entity let out a sound that was part scream and part electronic interference, alerting every other Wraith in the facility to the presence of an intruder. Sarah's stealth field collapsed under the intensity of their combined attention, leaving her exposed and vulnerable in the center of the control chamber. But it was too late for the Wraiths to stop what she had set in motion. Sarah triggered the cascade sequence, and the quantum charges began their coordinated assault on the shield matrix. Energy feedback loops formed and collapsed in microseconds, creating standing wave patterns that propagated through the crystalline network faster than the Wraith controllers could compensate. The shield generators began to overload, their crystalline components glowing with increasing intensity as they struggled to contain quantum forces that were growing beyond their design parameters. Sarah watched in fascination as her human engineering principles tore apart technology that was far more advanced than anything her species had ever built. The Wraith controllers were frantically trying to regain control of their systems, pouring their consciousness into the failing network in a desperate attempt to stabilize the cascade. But they were fighting against principles of quantum mechanics that transcended biological limitations, and their organic interfaces were becoming liabilities rather than advantages. Sarah felt a moment of unexpected pity for the entities that were struggling to save their fortress. They were clearly intelligent beings, possibly more advanced than humans in many ways, but they had never encountered the peculiar combination of stubbornness and technical ingenuity that characterized human engineering solutions. The shield matrix finally collapsed in a cascade of brilliant light and electromagnetic discharge that sent shockwaves through the entire fortress. Emergency systems activated throughout the structure, and Sarah could hear the distant sounds of secondary explosions as the shield failure triggered protective shutdowns in other critical systems. But her moment of triumph was brief. The Wraith controllers had abandoned their futile attempts to save the shields and were now converging on her position with obvious hostile intent. Sarah was trapped in the center of an enemy fortress, surrounded by beings that could drain the life force from her body with a touch, and her teammates were fighting for their lives kilometers away. As the first Wraith entity advanced toward her, its form crackling with predatory energy, Sarah realized that disabling the shields might have been the easy part of her mission. Now she had to survive long enough to escape and rejoin her team. Assuming any of them were still alive, the entity reached for her with tendrils of pure energy, and Sarah prepared to discover whether human determination was truly stronger than alien malevolence. Sarah's rifle discharged 3 quantum disruption rounds in rapid succession, each shot precisely aimed at the energy matrix that held the advancing Wraiths formed together. The entity staggered as its coherent structure wavered, but it didn't dissipate as she had hoped. Instead, it seemed to absorb the disruption energy and use it to stabilize its wounded form. The other Wraith controllers were closing in from multiple directions, their ghostly forms sliding through the organic walls as if they were merely suggestions rather than barriers. Sarah realized that her conventional weapons were worse than useless. They were actually feeding energy to her enemies. But human ingenuity had always thrived on seemingly impossible situations. Sarah switched her rifle to its emergency setting and aimed not at the Wraiths themselves, but at the quantum crystals that still glowed with residual energy from the shield matrix collapse. The disruption rounds struck the crystalline structures and shattered them into fragments that erupted with chaotic energy discharges. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The Wraiths recoiled from the quantum chaos, their energy-based forms unable to maintain coherence in the presence of such violent fluctuations. Sarah had turned the chamber's own technology against its guardians, creating a zone of quantum instability that the entities couldn't safely enter. But the reprieve was temporary. Even as Sarah watched, the wraiths were adapting to the new conditions, modifying their energy patterns to compensate for the quantum interference. She had perhaps minutes before they found a way to reach her, and the destruction she had caused was also destabilizing the chamber itself. Cracks were appearing in the organic walls as the fortress's structural integrity began to fail. The shield generators had been more deeply integrated into the building's architecture than the Coalition intelligence had realized, and their destruction was causing cascading failures throughout the facility. Sarah needed to escape before the entire section collapsed. She activated her suit's emergency beacon, sending a coded message to her teammates that the mission was complete, and she was attempting extraction. But as she searched for an escape route, Sarah realized that the nutrient conduit she had used to enter was now blocked by falling debris and ruptured organic systems. The sounds of battle from the exterior had changed again. Instead of the chaotic retreat she had heard before, Sarah now detected the organized patterns of a successful withdrawal. Her teammates had apparently broken free from the wraith trap and were moving to a safe distance, exactly as her coded instructions had specified. But that left her alone in a collapsing alien fortress, surrounded by hostile entities that were rapidly adapting to her countermeasures. The quantum disruption field was weakening as the crystal fragments exhausted their energy, and the wraiths were beginning to probe the barriers with increasing boldness. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed insane to any rational observer. Instead of looking for an exit, she began moving deeper into the fortress, following the energy conduits that connected the destroyed shield matrix to the central power core. If the facility was going to collapse anyway, she might as well ensure that it couldn't threaten anyone else. The corridors beyond the control chamber were filling with evacuating wraith entities, but they seemed more concerned with escaping the structural failures than pursuing a single human intruder. Sarah's small size and unfamiliar energy signature allowed her to move through the chaos without attracting attention, following the pulsing power conduits toward the fortress's heart. As she penetrated deeper into the facility, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what the wraiths had been building. The planet-killing weapon wasn't just a single device. It was the entire fortress, a massive organism that had been modified to focus and project life-draining energy across interstellar distances. The shield generators had been just one component of a system that could literally consume the life force of entire worlds. The central power core was a chamber the size of a cathedral, dominated by a massive organic structure that pulsed with the combined life energy of countless absorbed beings. Sarah's instruments detected quantum resonance patterns that matched the energy signatures of dozens of extinct species, each one preserved as a power source for the Wraith war machine. But the core's stability had been compromised by the shield matrix collapse. Energy feedback was building throughout the system, and Sarah's engineering experience told her that a catastrophic failure was inevitable. The question was whether she could control the timing and direction of that failure. Sarah activated her remaining quantum charges and began placing them at strategic points around the power core. If she could create a resonance cascade in the core itself, the explosion would destroy not just the fortress, but any wraith ships in the surrounding space. It would be a devastating blow to their war effort, possibly crippling their ability to launch similar attacks on other worlds. As she worked, Sarah became aware that she was no longer alone in the chamber. A massive presence had entered behind her, radiating power and malevolent intelligence that dwarfed the lesser wraith she had encountered earlier. She turned to see an entity that was clearly ancient and immensely powerful, its form crackling with the accumulated energy of eons. The wraith commander spoke in a voice that bypassed her ears and resonated directly in her consciousness. "Small creature of flesh and metal, you have caused considerable disruption to our operations. Your species shows promise as a source of unique energy patterns." Sarah continued her work on the charges, refusing to be intimidated by the entity's presence. "Sorry, but I'm not on the menu today." "And neither is anyone else." The commander's amusement was palpable. "You believe your primitive devices can threaten a facility that has existed for millennia? Your quantum disruption techniques are crude applications of principles we mastered before your sun ignited." "Maybe so," Sarah replied, activating the final charge. "But sometimes crude and primitive gets the job done." The quantum charges detonated simultaneously, sending cascades of disruption energy throughout the power core. The ancient Wraith commander recoiled in shock as the carefully balanced energy matrices that sustained the fortress began to collapse. The stolen life force of extinct civilizations was being released in an uncontrolled burst that threatened to tear apart the fabric of local spacetime. But instead of fleeing, the commander moved toward Sarah with obvious predatory intent. If I cannot preserve this facility, I will at least claim the life force of the creature that destroyed it. Your energy patterns will make an interesting addition to my collection. Sarah raised her rifle, knowing that conventional weapons would be useless against such a powerful entity. But as the commander reached for her with tendrils of pure death, something unexpected happened. The quantum disruption field that surrounded the failing power core began to resonate with her suit's defensive systems, creating a barrier that the Wraith couldn't penetrate. The commander paused, its ancient consciousness apparently confused by this development. Impossible. No biological entity can channel quantum disruption energy without being destroyed by it. Sarah smiled grimly. You're right, but I'm not just biological anymore. Her suit's systems had been modified with human engineering principles that the Wraiths had never encountered. Instead of fighting the quantum chaos, her equipment was designed to adapt and flow with it, using the disruption energy to strengthen rather than weaken her defenses. It was a technique based on human experience with chaotic systems, knowledge that had proven useful in ways she had never imagined. The power core was beginning its final collapse, and even the ancient commander realized that remaining in the chamber meant certain destruction. But as it prepared to flee, the entity fixed Sarah with a gaze that promised future vengeance. This victory is temporary, human. We will remember your species, and we will return. Sarah activated her suit's emergency teleportation system, a last resort device that would transport her to the nearest coalition ship. As the quantum field enveloped her, she looked back at the collapsing power core and the retreating Wraith commander. When you do return, she said, remember that it was the weak link that brought you down. The emergency teleportation deposited Sarah in the medical bay of the Valiant Dawn, her suit's systems automatically interfacing with the ship's computers to report her condition and mission status. She materialized on the transport pad in a cascade of quantum energy, her armor smoking from the massive electromagnetic discharge she had barely escaped. Dr. Kethvar, the ship's Altarian medical officer, immediately began scanning her with instruments that hummed with concern. Lieutenant Chen, your quantum exposure readings are off the scale. How are you still conscious? Sarah allowed herself to be helped to a medical bed, every muscle in her body aching from the strain of channeling quantum disruption energy. Human stubbornness, doctor, plus some creative engineering modifications that apparently work better than expected. Through the medical bay's viewports, she could see the spectacular destruction unfolding on Kepler 442b's surface. The Wraith fortress was collapsing in on itself, creating a pillar of energy that reached into the planet's atmosphere. Secondary explosions were chain reacting across the facility as power systems overloaded and structural supports failed. Commander Vexthul entered the medical bay, his massive form moving with uncharacteristic urgency. The Krillian's compound, eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression she had never seen before, something that might have been respect mixed with disbelief. Lieutenant Chen, he said formally, I require a complete mission briefing. Our sensors indicate that you achieved total destruction of the target facility, but the energy release patterns are unlike anything in our tactical databases. Sarah sat up despite Dr. Kethvar's protests, her body still trembling from quantum exposure. The fortress wasn't just a weapons platform, Commander. It was a massive organism that the Wraiths had converted into a life-draining system. When I destabilized the power core, it released the accumulated life force of dozens of extinct species. Captain Mordun and Sergeant Zix entered the medical bay as she spoke, both warriors showing signs of recent combat. Mordun's carapace was scorched by energy weapons, while Zix's bioluminescent patterns were flickering with exhaustion. But both aliens were staring at the destruction on the planet's surface with something approaching awe. The explosion is still growing, Zix reported, his usual skeptical tone replaced by wonder. Our long-range sensors detect quantum disruption effects spreading beyond the planetary atmosphere. Whatever you did in there, human, it's affecting the entire star system. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with her quantum exposure. How far is the disruption spreading? Are there inhabited systems in the affected area? Commander Vexthul consulted his tactical display. The nearest occupied worlds are outside the current disruption field, but the effect appears to be accelerating. We need to understand what you triggered before it becomes a threat to Coalition space. Dr. Kethvar completed his medical scans and looked up with confusion. Commander, her quantum exposure should have been fatal, but her cellular structure shows signs of adaptation rather than damage. This is unprecedented for any known species. Sarah realized that her modifications to survive the fortress infiltration had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The quantum disruption energy hadn't just been channeled through her equipment, it had somehow integrated with her own biological systems, creating a hybrid existence that was neither fully human nor entirely technological. The Wraith commander said something about unique energy patterns, she told them. I think human biology might be more compatible with quantum disruption fields than anyone realized. We evolved dealing with chaos and uncertainty in ways that other species didn't need to. The ship's communication system activated with an urgent priority signal from Coalition Command. Admiral Tethys, a cetacean whose massive form filled the holographic display, addressed them with obvious concern. Commander Vexthul, we're receiving reports of quantum disruption effects across multiple star systems. Whatever happened at the Wraith facility is causing ripple effects throughout local space. Some of our allied worlds are reporting atmospheric disturbances and gravitational anomalies. Sarah felt the weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders. In destroying the Wraith weapon, she might have triggered something even more dangerous. Admiral, the quantum cascade was designed to be contained within the fortress structure. If it's spreading beyond the target area, there must be something about Wraith technology that we don't understand. Admiral Tethys's massive eye focused on her through the holographic interface. Lieutenant Chen, our xenobiologists are analyzing your mission reports, and they believe the life force energy you released is seeking new hosts. The quantum disruption isn't random. It's being guided by the preserved consciousness of extinct species that want to live again. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had thought she was freeing the trapped life energy, but instead she might have unleashed the vengeful spirits of dead civilizations. The quantum disruption field wasn't just spreading randomly. It was actively seeking out living worlds where the extinct species could attempt to resurrect themselves. We need to contain the effect before it reaches inhabited systems, Commander Vexthul said grimly. But our weapons are designed for conventional warfare. We have no technology capable of stopping a quantum cascade of this magnitude. Sarah stood up from the medical bed, ignoring Dr. Kethvar's protests about her condition. Maybe conventional weapons aren't what we need. The cascade is being driven by consciousness, not just energy. If the extinct species want to live again, maybe we can give them what they want without destroying current civilizations. She moved to the medical bay's computer terminal and began accessing the data from her suit's sensors. The quantum patterns she had recorded during the power core collapse showed complex structures that resembled neural networks, more than random energy discharges. Look at these readings, she told them, highlighting specific frequency patterns. The disruption field isn't chaotic. It's organized. The extinct species are trying to communicate, to find suitable hosts for their consciousness transfer. Sergeant Zix's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that Sarah was learning to recognize as intense concentration. You're suggesting we negotiate with the consciousness patterns of dead civilizations? How does one conduct diplomacy with quantum ghosts? Sarah's mind was already working on the problem, applying human approaches to seemingly impossible challenges. The same way humans have always dealt with difficult situations. We adapt, we improvise, and we refuse to accept that something can't be done. Commander Vexthul's mandibles clicked in what might have been approval. What do you propose? Lieutenant? Sarah looked out at the growing quantum storm on the planet's surface, then back at her teammates who had once seen her as a liability. I propose we do something that probably violates every safety protocol in the Coalition manual. I'm going back into that quantum field to talk to the dead. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft hum of the ship's life support systems and the distant rumble of continuing explosions from the planet below. Sarah had just proposed perhaps the most dangerous mission in galactic history, and she was asking her teammates to trust the judgment of the human they had originally considered the team's weakest member. But as she looked at their faces, or the alien equivalents of faces, Sarah saw something that hadn't been there at the beginning of their mission. They were looking at her not as a liability to be protected, but as a problem solver whose unconventional thinking had already achieved the impossible once. The question was whether human ingenuity could work miracles twice in the same day. 3 hours later, Sarah stood in the Valiant Dawn's quantum laboratory, surrounded by equipment that had been hastily modified according to her specifications. Dr. Kethvar and the ship's engineering team had worked frantically to create a quantum communication array that could interface with the consciousness patterns in the expanding disruption field. Commander Bexthal watched the preparations with obvious concern. Lieutenant, the risk of permanent consciousness transfer is significant. If the extinct species decide to claim your mind as a host, we have no way to retrieve you. Sarah finished calibrating the quantum resonance helmet that would allow her to project her consciousness into the disruption field. Commander, respectfully, the risk of doing nothing is worse. The field will reach the Altarian colonies in 6 hours. We can't evacuate entire star systems. Captain Mordoon approached with data from the ship's sensors. The consciousness patterns are definitely organized and purposeful. Our xenopsychologists believe they represent at least 40 different extinct species, each one seeking compatible biological hosts for resurrection. Sergeant Zix's bioluminescent patterns showed colors that Sarah had learned to associate with deep thought. The irony is remarkable. The Wraiths consumed these civilizations to power their weapon, but in destroying the weapon, you've given them a chance at revenge against their killers. Sarah nodded, understanding the complex dynamics at work. But they don't just want revenge, they want to live again. The problem is that their idea of resurrection might involve replacing existing consciousness in living beings. We need to convince them that there are better alternatives. Dr. Kethvar completed his final medical scans and stepped back from the quantum communication array. Your neural patterns show increasing compatibility with quantum field structures. Whatever changes occurred during your exposure to the fortress's disruption energy, they're still progressing. The realization that she was becoming something no longer entirely human should have been terrifying, but Sarah felt only a calm acceptance. Her species had always survived by adapting to new environments, and this was just the most extreme adaptation in human history. Beginning quantum consciousness projection, she announced, activating the communication array. The helmet generated a field that surrounded her head with crackling energy, and Sarah felt her awareness expanding beyond the confines of her physical body. The quantum disruption field was a realm of pure consciousness and energy, where the boundaries between individual minds became fluid and permeable. Sarah found herself surrounded by the presence of dozens of extinct species, each one radiating the desperate hunger of beings who had been trapped in death for eons. Why do you enter our domain, creature of flesh? The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a composite of minds that had been merged by their shared captivity. Do you seek to join us in our quest for resurrection? Sarah projected calm determination as she replied, I come to offer you something better than theft of existing lives. My species understands adaptation and survival. We can help you find new forms of existence that don't require destroying other civilizations. The response was a wave of skeptical amusement from multiple alien consciousness. Your species is young and naive. You know nothing of the true price of extinction. We have been dead for millennia while our killers grew fat on our stolen life force. But you're not truly dead, Sarah pointed out. You've survived as conscious energy, maintaining your individual identities despite being absorbed into the Wraith weapon. That's not death, that's transformation. She could feel the extinct minds considering her words, their attention focusing on her with uncomfortable intensity. Some of the species represented were far older and more advanced than humanity, but none of them had experience with the particular type of stubborn optimism that characterized human problem-solving. You propose what, exactly? Asked a consciousness that identified itself as the last survivor of the Kethmaran civilization. That we remain as disembodied energy, while living beings enjoy the flesh we have been denied? Sarah projected images and concepts drawn from human history and technology. I propose that you become something new. Hybrid beings that combine consciousness energy with technological substrates. My species has been developing artificial intelligence and virtual reality systems that could provide you with new forms of existence. The idea sparked intense debate among the extinct minds, their thoughts creating swirling patterns of agreement and disagreement that manifested as visible distortions in the quantum field. Sarah could sense that some species were intrigued by the possibility, while others remained focused on reclaiming biological existence. Your proposal has merit, admitted another consciousness, one that belonged to a species of energy beings who had been absorbed despite their non-physical nature. But implementation would require unprecedented cooperation between living and extinct civilizations. Why should your allies trust us with such technology? Sarah had anticipated this objection and prepared her most compelling argument. Because you've already proven that you can be trusted, you could have simply possessed the first living beings you encountered. But instead you've maintained the disruption field as a warning, giving us time to find an alternative solution. The observation seemed to surprise some of the extinct minds, as if they hadn't consciously recognized their own restraint. Sarah pressed her advantage, projecting images of coalition worlds where extinct species could be given new homes in specially designed quantum computers and android bodies. Consider this, she continued. The Wraiths thought they could consume you and use your consciousness as mere fuel for their weapons. But you've proven that death isn't the end, that consciousness can survive and adapt beyond the destruction of physical form. You could become the foundation of a new type of civilization, one that bridges the gap between energy and matter. The debate among the extinct minds intensified, with species taking sides based on their own pre-death philosophies and cultural values. But Sarah could sense a growing consensus around the idea that resurrection might not require the displacement of existing life. Very well, announced the collective consciousness. We will accept your proposal to attempt this hybrid existence, but understand that if your species betrays us or attempts to exploit our cooperation, we retain the power to reclaim biological hosts by force. Sarah felt a surge of relief as the quantum disruption field began to stabilize, its chaotic expansion slowing as the extinct minds focused their energy on controlled manifestation, rather than random seeking. Understood, but I think you'll find that humans are pretty good at keeping their promises, especially when the stakes are this high. As she prepared to withdraw her consciousness from the quantum field, Sarah felt a final communication from the collective minds. You are an unusual specimen of your species, consciousness shaper. Your own hybrid nature makes you a bridge between our kinds. We will remember this service. Sarah's awareness snapped back to her physical body in the ship's laboratory, where her teammates were monitoring her vital signs with obvious concern. The quantum disruption readings showed that the field expansion had stopped, and the chaotic energy patterns were beginning to organize into more stable configurations. Status report, Commander Vexthul demanded as soon as Sarah opened her eyes. Mission accomplished, she replied, removing the quantum communication helmet. The extinct species have agreed to explore alternative forms of resurrection that don't involve displacing existing consciousness. We'll need to coordinate with coalition scientists to develop suitable technological platforms, but the immediate crisis is over. Captain Mordun studied the sensor readings with amazement. The disruption field is actually becoming more organized. Whatever you said to them, it convinced them to work with us rather than against us. Sergeant Zix's bioluminescent patterns shifted to colors that Sarah now recognized as deep respect. Human, you have accomplished something that military strategists considered impossible. You have negotiated a peace treaty with the dead. Dr. Kethvar completed his post-mission medical scans and looked up with wonder. Your quantum integration levels have increased again. You're becoming something unprecedented, a living bridge between conventional matter and pure consciousness energy. Sarah stood up from the examination chair, feeling the strange new aspects of her existence settling into place. She was no longer entirely human, but she was still fundamentally herself, still the engineer who refused to accept that problems couldn't be solved. Admiral Tethys will want a full report, Commander Vexthul said, but his tone had changed completely from their first meeting, where once there had been dismissive tolerance. Now there was genuine respect and perhaps even awe. Sarah nodded, then looked around at her teammates, beings who had started the mission seeing her as a liability, and were now looking at her as something approaching a miracle worker. Commander, I think this mission proves that the Coalition's strength isn't in having the biggest weapons or the toughest warriors. It's in bringing together different perspectives and finding solutions that none of us could discover alone. The Krillian's mandibles. Clicked in what Sarah had learned was his species equivalent of a smile. Lieutenant Chen, I believe the Coalition's assessment protocols may need significant revision. It appears that what we identified as weaknesses in human capabilities were actually unique strengths that we simply failed to recognize. As the valiant Dawn prepared to depart from the now stable quantum field around Kepler-Kordinskorkubi, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from maintenance engineer to diplomatic pioneer. Her teammates no longer saw her as the weak link in their chain. They saw her as proof that sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly what the universe needs. Behind them, the quantum field settled into patterns that would eventually become the foundation for an entirely new form of civilization. The extinct species would live again, not as parasites stealing life from others, but as partners in a grand experiment that combined consciousness, technology, and hope. And somewhere in the quantum patterns that surrounded the dead world, 40 extinct civilizations prepared to kneel in respect to the small human who had given them back their future.